Hi guys, I'm a bit unmotivated today. It is Friday, our last day of lockdown. Woohoo! I'm excited. I normally come in and do this first thing, and it is now 2 o'clock, so I'm doing it last. Anyway, we're doing pages 71 to 95 today. Miles began hosing down the deck, and ice cold spray showered his face and hands. If it wasn't for the ache in his ribs and the bullet hole in the deck, he might have thought that yesterday had never happened, because everything was normal. They'd just gone out like normal, only Martin was gone. That was the difference. Jeff left early as usual, and Dad was in the cabin. Miles walked in as he turned the engine over. It didn't sound good. It spluttered and shook and had sounded like that all day. They had hardly found anything at the fryers. The huge abs that had been there yesterday were gone. There was nothing at the Tasman Head either, nothing anywhere, no matter how many times Dad went down. Will we be able to go out tomorrow? Miles asked. Dad didn't answer. Miles should have backed away. He should have left Dad alone, but he didn't. He wanted the engine to be broken. It sounds bad. The engine sounds. Dad slammed his hands down on the dash. You think I can just pick and choose when we go out? You think I have a fucking choice? He turned to Miles, clenched his fists. Get out of here, he said. Miles backed out of the cabin, but Dad suddenly pushed past him and jumped off the boat. Miles watched him march down the wharf. He stopped at the ute for a minute, and Miles thought that he might get in and just drive off, but he didn't. He kept walking. He walked across the road. He was going to the pub. Miles stood on the deck. He wasn't sure what to do. The boat couldn't stay here. This spot on the wharf would be needed in the morning for the cray boats and the night trawlers. Miles looked over to their mooring site in the middle of the bay. It was parked by a pink boy, and the dinghy was there waiting. One of Mr. Roberts' big 40-foot dive boats, Reef Runner 2, was pulling in nearby. He had 3 of them now, all white fiberglass, clean and new. They dwarfed Dad's boat and made her seem more wrecked than she was, more faded. Miles would have to move the boat himself. He tugged on the thick rope and kept the boat secured to the wharf, but the loop rope wouldn't budge from the stumpy pole. He climbed up onto the wharf, stood as close as possible to the edge, and wrenched the loop free. He threw the thick rope on the deck, leapt after it, and bolted to the cabin. By the time he got the engine into drive, the boat had pulled out metres from the wharf. But getting to the moorings was the easy part. The dinghy was always hard to start, especially in winter. Miles pushed the prime button through 3 times to give himself the best chance. He pulled the cord as hard as he could, and it nearly caught. Nearly. He tried again, but it wasn't close this time. He tried 5 more times. Nothing. Dad usually got it on the 2nd or 3rd go, but after 12 attempts, Miles was panting and he was coughing again and sweating. He primed the engine again, pushing the soft button that squirted diesel around inside, and he pulled with all he had, with his whole body. He had to get it started. He had to get it this time, but it didn't start. He let go of the cord and coughed into his hands. He sat down. He'd have to rest for a bit, then try again. Another dinghy started. Miles looked up and saw Mr. Roberts putting in his direction. He waved and Miles waved back. Jump in, we'll tow it. Mr. Roberts held the dinghies together while Miles hopped over. He hadn't thought about what he'd do if he couldn't start the dinghy. There wasn't much he could do. Finishing up on your own today, Miles, he said. Nah, I asked if I could do it by myself. Miles looked away. He was embarrassed at the lie. Mr. Roberts had probably seen Dad storm off, and he knew Dad, what he was like. Back at the wharf, Miles said goodbye, but he didn't have anywhere to go. He walked up to the ute. It was locked. He couldn't even wait in the car, and he didn't want to go into the pub. Not until he was totally desperate anyway. Arnie's Jean's house wasn't too far away, but he didn't want to go there. He didn't want to ask her for anything. He could go walk to Joe's and see if he was home. It was only a 40-minute walk, but if he wasn't there, he was stuck. I'll give you a lift. It was Mr. Roberts again. He was suddenly right there behind him. It's out of your way, Miles said, and he covered his mouth as he started to cough again. Mr. Roberts pulled something out of his pocket. It was a packet of butter menthols. I'll just go and tell your dad then, he said. Miles watched Mr. Roberts cross the road and go into the pub. He was a tall man, he was like a bear, and Dad didn't like him much. No one did since he got rich off abalone, since he'd bought 3 new boats and built a new house and sent his kids to private school. But it was strange. Mr. Roberts didn't seem to care about what other people thought. He really didn't. It was the way he walked, the way he talked and laughed, he wasn't scared of anything. And maybe he really wasn't scared of anything. People said he'd been lucky, but Miles thought he'd been smart. He'd built up slowly so that no one even noticed. And he didn't sell to the cannery like everybody else. He took his catch up to Hobart, where the larger abs got more money and were snap frozen and sent to Asia, whole, shells and all. He started like all of them, and he started back when Dad and Nick had. Miles got in the passenger seat of Mr. Roberts' station wagon and sucked on a butter menthol. It was the newest, nicest car he'd ever been in. The seats were covered in thick, soft material, and the heater blew warm air as soon as they started moving. Mr. Roberts, I'm still a bit wet. Should I sit on a towel or something? Mr. Roberts shook his head. He slapped his leg to show Miles that his pants were wet too. I'm always a bit damp, he said. Anyway, call me Brian. No one calls me Mr. Roberts except for Justin's new headmistress. I forget her name. Cleary or something? Real piece of work. Mr. Roberts laughed and Miles smiled too. It was hard to imagine Justin Roberts at private school in a uniform and wearing a tie, with that long floppy hair of his that hung down over his eyes, so you could only see his big mouth and teeth sticking out. Is he doing all right? Miles asked. Only thing he likes is the footy team. Good, apparently. Haven't been up to see a game, but he'll be down here next week. You boys should catch up for a wave. Miles nodded, even though he knew Justin and he probably wouldn't see each other. He hadn't seen him for ages. Not out in the water anyway. They used to be friends, used to surf, but that all felt like a long time ago, a lifetime. Mr. Roberts drove slowly, even on the straight bit of road. He kept a steady pace and his knees hugged the bottom of the steering wheel, his hands resting loose on top. The windows were tinted just slightly so that the grey sky seemed to be a midnight blue. Miles would have liked to keep on driving for a long time, to rest down against the warm seat and listen to Mr. Roberts talk, to keep on going until there was no more road. But then he saw them, on a tight bend before the river. Flowers tied to the tree, white lilies right there tied to that river gum. Miles choked on his butter menthol. He grabbed madly at the door, felt the car pull over, and then he got the door open. He leant over and coughed out a pool of phlegm and spit, whatever was left of the butter menthol. Jesus, are you all right? Mr. Roberts was out of the car. He'd come round and was standing on the side of the road. Miles couldn't speak. He wiped his mouth. He sat back in his seat. He didn't want to look at Mr. Roberts, and he tried not to look outside at all, but his eyes kept finding that tree. He kept staring at the tree and at the lilies until he knew that they were real, that the flowers were really there, like they had been after she died. For months and months, fresh lilies on the tree. Mr. Roberts took his time getting back in the car, and when he did, he didn't start the engine. But a menthol went down the wrong way, Miles said. Mr. Roberts didn't say anything, not for a bit. He handed Miles a hanky. I never pass here without thinking of her, you know. Not without thinking of your mum. It must have been bloody terrible. Miles blew his nose on the hanky. He shut his eyes. I don't really remember, he said. When he opened his eyes, Miles looked at the tree again. It still had a scar, a line where the bark had never grown back, and it was amazing that it had survived at all. They had hit it so hard. When they pulled up the drive, Miles opened the passenger door. He went to get out, but Mr. Roberts put his hand on his shoulder and held him back. Don't you get stuck here with your dad, he said. Don't you let him. You're too young to be out there working, Miles. It's not right. Miles felt the words sink right down inside him. You've had it rough enough, he said, and then he let Miles go. The Milo had to last for ages, a month, but Miles looked bad. He looked tired, still coughing all the time, and even though the milk wasn't good for a cold, that's what Auntie Jean said anyway, there wasn't anything else. Harry wanted to make Miles the best hot Milo ever, and it was still early, and they could watch the afternoon cartoons and put the fire on. He heaped 4 tablespoons of Milo into Miles's cup, and the hot milk went down dark brown. He sprinkled more Milo on top, just a bit, and it looked good. It smelled good, but when he took the cup over, Miles' eyes were closed. He was already asleep, his head leaning back, resting on top of the couch. Harry sat down beside him, holding the Milo. Miles, he said quietly, Miles. But he didn't wake up. Auntie Jean's house was white on the outside and white on the inside, and they had to leave their boots at the door. Sometimes she made them take off their socks as well in case they were damp and left marks on the thick new carpet. She always offered them clean socks to put on, but Miles would never touch them. Anyway, the carpet felt nice on his bare feet, springy and soft, but the Saturday afternoon roast always took forever to cook. It was some kind of dark meat this time, beef maybe, and it did taste good. The gravy was salty and it soaked into the roast potatoes. Miles ate fast. If they got out of Auntie Jean's soon, there would be time for a surf with Joe when he picked them up. But when he finished, he saw that Harry had barely touched his. He didn't like meat much. He'd only eaten the potatoes. It was driving Miles mad watching him move bits of meat and carry it around and around, making rings of gravy on the plate. "Try and eat some meat, Harry," Auntie Jean said. Harry looked at Miles and Miles stared back. He kicked Harry's leg under the table, but that didn't work. He wouldn't eat any more. Auntie Jean put a knife and fork down on her plate, and finally they were allowed to get up and take the dishes into the kitchen. The clock above the cooker said it was 1:55 p.m. Miles filled the sink and started to wash the dishes. He squeezed the detergent hard and made the water slimy and full of suds, and he washed like mad, lining the dishes up neatly in the rack until it was full. Auntie Jean came into the kitchen and put the kettle on. She got out 3 teacups and put them on the bench. "I don't want any tea," Miles said, and he picked up the tea towel and began drying the plates. Auntie Jean crumpled up a nose. "Well, I do," she said. "I'll have one," Harry called from the dining room. Miles knew he just wanted the biscuits that came with the tea. "I'll cut your hair after," Jean said. "You both need it," and then she smiled. They were stuck. Miles watched Harry squirm on the stool in the kitchen as Auntie Jean pulled at his hair with the comb. Every time he tried to move his head, she grabbed his face and held him still. "That's what you get for having curly hair, young man," she said. She wasn't even a bit like Mum. It was hard to believe they were sisters, because Auntie Jean was like an old lady. She dressed like an old lady, smelled like an old lady, and she had arthritis like an old lady. And he hoped they hurt her fat knees, her puffy ankles that spilled over her shoes, all that fluid moving around when she walked, moving around but never going away. "Go to the cupboard and get a towel," she said suddenly, and when Miles looked up she was staring right at him. He turned away and walked down the hall. The linen cupboard was huge, and there were piles of sheets and pillowcases and quilts, and Miles didn't know what the hell they were all for. Auntie Jean lived alone. She had been alone for ages, since Uncle Nick, and no one ever came to visit except them, and they never stayed over. Never. The towels were on a shelf at eye height, and they were all white. There were no other colours, not even cream. It was weird. Miles pulled one out, but they were packed in so tight that about 5 came loose and fell on the floor. He bent down to pick them up, and there was a wooden box at the bottom of the cupboard. It was a big box, pushed right to the back. Old wood, dark like blackwood. He had never seen it before. He looked down the hall. He could hear Auntie Jean talking, but the door to the kitchen was closed, just enough so that he couldn't see her. He squatted down and pulled the box out. It had brass handles and carved flowers on the lid. Inside there were carefully folded things, soft things. They were all baby things. "Miles, the towel!" Miles shut the lid and slid the box away. He picked up one of the towels and shoved the rest back in the cupboard without folding them. While Auntie Jean cut his hair, he stared straight ahead. She talked on and on about selling Grandad's house, but he just kept thinking about the box. He just kept thinking about the little blankets and the baby clothes and how all that stuff was perfect and clean and never used. "What am I meant to do? What am I meant to do?" she kept saying, and he heard her voice rise up. The familiar tears come. "I grew up in that house, Miles. Don't I deserve something?" Harry was sitting on the edge of the bath when Miles walked into the bathroom. "Jesus," he said, his curls all gone, his eyes bigger than normal because his hair was so short, and it made Miles smile the way Harry just said Jesus like that, the way they both looked terribly like freshly shorn sheep. Mum never used to cut Harry's hair short. She told him that the curls were lucky and should be left alone. Harry liked that, and he believed her. He believed everything. He even let her brush his hair every night without complaining. Dad even brushed Harry's hair back then to stop it getting knotted. Miles wiped his neck and face with the face washer to get the hair off before it started itching. His hair was really short, and she may as well have just used the clippers. "That's the last time," Miles said. Harry nodded, but he didn't look convinced. By lunchtime, the shed was half empty. Out on the grass, the throwaway pile was much smaller than the keep pile, thanks to Miles. He fought Joe over every piece of furniture and every tool, saying it was wrong to throw any of Grandad's stuff away. Harry agreed, but he didn't say anything. He just tried to stay out of the way. He waited on the lawn until someone told him what to move and what he could touch and where he could put things, because he kept doing everything wrong. Most of the things in the shed were too heavy for him to lift, and it was dark and full of cobwebs, and he knew there were spiders in there. He'd already got 2 splinters from moving wood because there were no gloves that fit his hands. They were all too big, and he should have just gone to Stuart's. Joe took the first load of junk to the tip, and Harry thought about going into the house and sitting down inside for a bit. It was cold and the wind was coming off the bay, and Miles hadn't called or come out of the shed for ages. Maybe he'd gone in the house and Harry hadn't noticed. Harry walked over and poked his head through the shed door. It seemed so much bigger inside now that it was half empty, big and dark. He couldn't see Miles anywhere. "Miles!" No answer. Harry stayed in the doorway anyway. There was still so much stuff in the shed. It was going to take them all day. They wouldn't be doing anything else, just this. "Miles!" "I'm here," he said. His voice came from down the back, behind a stack of old chairs. Harry made his way over, ducking through spaces left between furniture. Miles was sitting down on a low seat, leaning against the back wall of the shed. "It's Mum's," he said. Harry didn't know what he was talking about. He looked on the ground and then behind him. "It's from the car. It's the back seat from Mum's car." Harry looked at what Miles was sitting on. He couldn't tell what colour the seat was because there wasn't enough light, but he remembered that the seats in Mum's car were red, dark cherry red, and that they were always slippery and shiny and cold in the mornings. He remembered that the doors in the back had wooden panels, and that he could run his matchbox cars along. "You wouldn't remember," Miles said. Harry sat down next to Miles. "I remember," he said. He ran his fingers along the cold leather. The seat belts were still attached. He found the middle metal buckle, pressed the button with his finger, and it still worked. He looked at Miles. He didn't know why the seat was here. He didn't understand. Miles was staring ahead, and Harry watched him slip both of his hands into the wide gap where the seat bottom and back joined. Harry remembered that his matchbox cars used to end up there sometimes, and Miles would fish them out for him. He put one hand into the gap too, but his fingers only found dust and grit. Then his hand touched the sticky threads of spiderweb, and he pulled it out quickly and stood up. Miles had something in his hand. He'd found something in the seat, something small attached to a string. "What is it?" Harry asked. Miles held the string out for Harry to see, for him to take, and it was heavy, a big triangle of bone, sharp on the sides. "What is it?" "It's a white pointer's tooth," Miles said, and he said it like he knew it, like he was sure. "Hello?" It was Joe. Harry hadn't heard his van pull up, but he was standing in the light by the shed door. Miles grabbed the tooth out of Harry's hand. He stood up and put it in his pocket. "What are you doing back here?" Joe bent over and picked up something from the ground. It was a steering wheel. He held it up in both hands. "Jesus," he said, and Miles showed him the rest, the crumpled bumper bar and the bent doors, the whole boot and the back axle, but he didn't show him the tooth. Joe put the steering wheel down and wiped his hands on the front of his jeans. "Maybe we should stop for a bit and have lunch." Outside, the light hurt Harry's eyes. Miles and Joe walked towards the house, but Harry stayed on the grass. He shielded his eyes with his hands. "What are we going to do with it?" he asked. He knew Miles would never let Joe chuck Mum's seat out, take it to the tip. The seat and the steering wheel and whatever else was there would go on the keep pile. They would keep it. But Miles kept on walking. He went into the house. Joe stopped on the veranda and rested his arms on the railing. "I don't know why Grandad kept all that stuff, but I don't think he should have. I don't think he should have kept those things." And he turned to go inside. He told Harry he'd make him a sandwich, but Harry stayed where he was. He stayed among the piles of Grandad's things left on the lawn, all the things that were no longer needed and no longer useful, and he wished that Joe would stay. And that's where we'll stop today. We're up to page 95.